In this audio recording, I will talk to you about how to write a history essay thesis and outline. Writing in an essay or a paper for a history class is different than writing an essay for an English class or for another discipline. Most academic disciplines have different ways of writing. By the time you reach the college level, how you are going to write a history essay is going to be quite different than how you will write an essay for an English class. So for historians, there are various building blocks or pieces of your essay. Your essay needs to include a thesis statement, and this thesis statement needs to come very early in the paper in the introduction. The thesis statement provides a 1 to 3 sentence answer to the question, and it is the central argument for your paper. Everything that you write about in your paper should help support or argue your thesis statement. And the thesis statement needs to answer all parts of the question. So for historians, there are no secrets when you're writing an essay. You don't hold anything back. You put your full argument right up front in the introduction. So you don't try to persuade your reader of something and then put your thesis towards the end of the paper, or build up your ideas and then state your argument. Your argument comes right at the beginning. Historians are very insistent upon that. So you need to fully answer the question in a succinct or concise way in the thesis. Also, for any historical essay, you're going to have some background. You need to situate your reader in the historical context. So the reader of your essay needs to know, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about the 1950s and the Cold War? Are we talking about the 1790s and the Constitution? So your reader needs to know where and when you are in time. So at some point early on in the paper, you need to establish or explain the historical context. Historians also consider evidence extremely important. Now, you can make a really incredible argument. So you can come up with this great idea, maybe something nobody has ever thought of. But if you don't prove it, your job is only half done. You have to prove the arguments that you make in a history paper. You can imagine as you're writing your paper, a historian leaning over your shoulder and just saying, prove it, prove it, prove it, whenever you make an argument. So you need to provide evidence for all of your arguments in the paper. Historians use two kinds of evidence: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are documents created during the time period you are studying. So if, for instance, you are talking about the Lowell Mill and you use a political cartoon from that time period, then that would be a primary source. Secondary sources are written by people who didn't live through the time period. So mostly historians write secondary sources. So a historian today writing about the Lowell Mill would become a secondary source. So this is a sample thesis statement. This is not our essay question. This is an essay question that's just an example of something that might be used for another class. If you were to take History 102, the second portion of this survey, you might get a question like this. So, did the civil rights movement create economic, social, and political equality for African Americans? So, if that was the question, this might be a thesis, a student's thesis that answers the question. The civil rights movement failed to create perfect equality for African Americans. Now, that answers the question, but it doesn't explain the major ideas or the major arguments that are going to prove this. It doesn't elaborate on anything. So this thesis statement would get a grade of a C. Okay, it answers the question, but it's much too general. Now here's a better thesis statement. The civil rights movement failed to create perfect equality for African Americans. And then the student goes on to elaborate or explain this in more detail. Although the movement made important gains in social and political equality by ending segregation and ensuring the African American right to vote, it failed to establish economic equality. Now, this is an excellent thesis statement that would earn a grade of an A. And this thesis statement not only answers the question, it also provides the general organization for the paper. So the student writing this thesis statement, when they went to outline their paper, this would probably be a classic 5-paragraph essay. They'd have an introduction where they stated the thesis, and then the first paragraph would describe the social gains. Okay. The second paragraph, take a second and look at it and think about what you think would be the topic of the second paragraph. And that would be political equality. So the second paragraph would probably be about political equality. And finally, the third paragraph would describe the failure to establish economic equality. Now, a student who would be making an outline based on this thesis statement, let me talk about outlines in general, and then we'll look at an outline. So when you write the outline for your paper, your outline is going to logically lay out the paragraphs and ideas and evidence to be used in your paper. And you're going to do it in point form, not full sentences. You're not writing the paper. It is not a rough draft. This is just saying what your ideas are going to be. Okay, it's not writing them all out. Your thesis needs to be in full sentence form, but nothing else should be in full sentence form. Now, you'll notice in your outline, you're going to need to say the topic of the paragraphs, the central idea for each paragraph, and this part here, the evidence to be used in each paragraph. This is the piece that students sometimes neglect to include, and it'll hurt your grade if you don't include this. You have to include the evidence in the outline. The outline should begin with an introduction, and it's in that introduction you're going to describe the historical background to the paper, and for this one it would be you really have 2 historical backgrounds, and that is the establishment of public education and then also community colleges today. The introduction should state the thesis. Each paragraph should have one main idea that helps argue the thesis, and it needs that evidence in there to prove the idea in the paragraph. And your paragraphs need to be in some kind of a logical, organized fashion that helps to argue the thesis. So the reader shouldn't be surprised, like, why are we talking about this now? They should expect that this next paragraph will make sense. So here's the sample of the beginning of an outline. So if we are going to use this A thesis statement here, now notice that this outline is in point form, and I've just written historical background, but the student would fill this in and do points that said, for instance, early civil rights movement. It might say 1960s, 50s through the 70s. They put just a general overview here. And then the thesis is written out in sentence form, but nothing else. Now, the first paragraph for this essay, the general topic is here in a point form, social successes of the civil rights movement. And the argument the student is making in this paragraph is here in point form. The civil rights movement succeeded in ending segregation in the American South. Okay, that's in point form here. And then very importantly, here's the evidence. Now, the student hasn't written out the quote or anything like that, but has shown, well, I'm going to refer to Farragher, that's the author, and it's on page 929. And I'm going to use a quote from the Supreme Court from page 1003. And now when the student goes to write the paper, think about how easy it's going to be to write this paper when they already have the evidence lined up. They don't have to go searching for it when they're in the middle of writing. It makes writing much easier and smoother. Also for the instructor, I can look and see, is the student using appropriate evidence? Is there enough evidence? Are they using a variety of evidence? So I can help you out here and give you some guidance when you include evidence. The conclusion of your paper, so the final paragraph. In the final paragraph, you're going to restate your thesis, but try not to say it in exactly the same way. Try to use different words to make that same argument. Also, you'll want to give a larger statement about why this is important. So you went through the trouble of writing about this and collecting your sources and making an argument. So in the grand scheme of things, why is this important? So here is our essay question. Referring to the textbook and to the assigned reading by Chad Hansen, compare and contrast Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson's opinions about the purpose of education. Today, does President Obama's American Graduation Initiative adopt a Hamiltonian or Jeffersonian vision of the purpose of education? In your opinion, is this the right direction for community colleges today? Fully explain your opinion. Now, this essay question is accomplishing something that many history instructors want their students to think about, and that is how the past continues to influence our world today. So people, when they develop their policies, they're thinking about the past. President Barack Obama is very aware of which approach he is adopting. So the past continues to shape the world that we live in today, and this is one essay question that leads you to think about that. So this essay question has a variety of different parts, and some of those parts are trickier than other parts. And in your mind, you might look at this question and think, wow, I really want to talk about this one particular part. Or you might really know the answer to one part of the question, and you'll want to spend the bulk of the paper talking about that. That's natural. We want to avoid the part that's trickier, that requires more work, but don't do that. Make sure that your paper is answering all parts of the question, even the tricky parts. So this question has three primary parts. The first part is asking you to go into the past, compare and contrast Hamilton and Jefferson and how they feel about education and the purpose of education. So this is really the historical component of the paper. The second piece asks you then to take a look at a contemporary development, the American Graduation Initiative, which is about community colleges. And you want to use the past to better understand that initiative. So is this a Hamiltonian or a Jefferson vision? And you need to prove it. And you might prove it by using a quote from President Obama. And you really should use a quote here. And then the third piece is asking for your opinion. So in this third piece, don't just throw this in at the last minute. You really want to talk about this. Your opinion is important, and your opinion matters. And you should spend some time explaining it. So, just to reiterate, your thesis statement and the essay need to fully answer all three parts of the question. Even if you're tempted to just focus in on one, make sure you're answering each part. So for our essay outline, you're going to need there are some necessary components for your outline. And you don't have to copy this, but you will want to have an introduction with the thesis statement. You need to explain Hamilton's vision of education, Jefferson's vision of education. You need to analyze Obama and the graduation initiative, and you need your opinion. Now, your opinion shouldn't just come in the conclusion. It needs to be part of the body of your essay. Okay, so you'll want to have all of these components. Now, if you just copy this outline and turn it in, that's not going to work. You're going to be missing your major arguments and the evidence you're going to be using. So you need to make an argument. You need to summarize Hamilton's vision, Jefferson's vision, the analysis of Obama, and include the evidence. Here are the sources that we are using for our essay. We will use a couple of pages from the textbook, a chapter from a book that talks precisely about this topic, and also there's a press release about the graduation initiative, and finally President Obama's remarks about the graduation initiative. And you can look at this both as there's a video of him speaking and then also a text. When you are citing your sources, so when you use a quote or you refer to a unique bit of evidence, you need to cite the source. You need to tell your reader where this came from. Now, we do not have time in our short session here, or even in any of my survey courses, we don't have time to go over proper bibliographic outline, the way to do a proper bibliography. So you do not need to include a bibliography or formal footnotes in your paper. Instead of that, you will simply put the author's name or the speaker's name in brackets. And if there is a page number, you can include that as well. So for instance, if you were quoting the author of our textbook, you would say, Keene argues that, or you'd have some other opening here. And then you'd put in the quote, inland cities became manufacturing centers and transportation hubs. And then you put the authors in brackets. You'd have the author's name, and this is from a book, so we have a page number here. Okay. Now, Keene argues is in red here because I wanted to remind you that when you include a quote, you need to tell your reader who is saying this, who wrote this, who's saying this. You can't just throw it in there without introducing the quote and the author of the quote. So you always need to introduce the author of a quote. So there are two sources that might be a little tricky. The White House Office of the Press Secretary, this is from a press release that's posted on the web, and also Barack Obama's oral remarks. So if you cite this press release, after the quote, just put press secretary in brackets. And if you cite the speech that President Obama made, just write President Obama in brackets after the citation. All right. Well, I hope that helps you with writing your thesis outline, and I look forward to reading your papers and learning more about your opinions on this issue. Thank you.